All right, so once again, Brendan Schaub finds himself in some controversy and he's making terrible decisions, but this story is hilarious. So there's this kid that Brendan hired maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, because he was a huge fan of his, and he called into King and the Sting one day, and Brendan told him if he lost weight, he would fly him out to LA and he could go to one of his shows and he'd bring him on stage and he'd like wrestle somebody or something. And the kid did it. He lost over 200 pounds, I think it was, which is really impressive. And it's cool that Brendan motivated him to do that. But then after that, Brendan convinced him to stay in LA and work for Thick Boy Studios. And then just recently, there's a rumor that Brendan might have fired him. And this started when Mark Harley, Brendan's former baddie wrangler, made this post about it. He got a message from George's mom, the kid that Brendan allegedly fired, where she said, well, guess what? Brendan's lawyer just called George and they let him go. They said they can't afford to pay him. And then he has to figure out how to get back home on the little savings he has. So Mark Harley, he sent this message to Brendan and Brian Callen, and he said you couldn't even call him yourself, which is hilarious that Brendan had his lawyer do this. And of course, Brendan, he didn't respond to this at all, but Brian Callen, he did. He sent a message back to Mark, which we'll get to here in a second. But first, I want to thank today's sponsor, Factor 75. This is a great service. With Factor, they send you high quality, fresh, never frozen meals right to your doorstep each week, and they're ready to go in only 2 minutes, so it saves you a ton of time, and you could skip the meal planning, grocery shopping, preparing, and cleanup. So if you're somebody like me who is lazy and not very good at cooking, this service is worth it. And they have plenty of different options. They offer keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan plus veggie options, which include seafood, meat, and plant-based meals. And their menus are updated weekly and include over 27 different meals and 33 add-ons. And if you're interested and want to get started today, you can head over to factor75.com, or you can click the link below and use code 2lazy50 to get 50% off your first box. Again, that's factor75.com, or use the link below and use code 2lazy50 to get 50% off your first box. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video. So Brian Callen sent a message back to Mark and said, actually, I didn't hire him, nor did I know he was fired until Lex let him go, and apparently we are still paying him. I'm also talking to him to try to figure out somewhere to work. I called him the second I heard. Remember, he's not my employee, but I care about the kid, obviously, so trying to help him in any way I can. If you have any ideas, let me know. So it was at least good that Brian got back to him, because also it's not really his problem. Like he said, Brendan's the one that hired him, but of course Brian has to deal with it now. And Mark responded and said, this was meant to be to Brendan. He just tagged Brian because he figured he was blocked by Brendan. So then after this, of course, the story blew up on the Fighter and the Kid subreddit, and it's obviously a bad look for Brendan. There's some videos that people were posting that did not age very well. And also, Brendan convinced this kid to fly out there and work for him. And Brendan allegedly fired him because he couldn't pay him, which is pretty ridiculous because Brendan, I'm pretty sure, just got that $1.6 million he was owed from Podcast One that he said he needed to pay his employees. And then also Brendan just started that car show that I'm sure he spends a ton of money on, and he probably only loses money on it. And also, I'm pretty sure he hired an employee after he hired George. So if they're still there and George is gone, this is a bad look. I mean, either way, it is. And I think Brendan realized it because after all this information came out, George posted this to Instagram and said, for anyone concerned, I will be working remotely for Brendan Schaub for the foreseeable future. I appreciate everyone's concern. And while I have a lot of big decisions, I love my Los Angeles family and I look forward to my future. So maybe Brendan didn't fire him, or what I actually believe is George was let go, and then it became a story on the Fighter and the Kid subreddit, and Brian was like, dude, this is a bad look. Brian, he at least has some sense here, and he probably told Brendan, we got to figure this out, and they thought this was the best move. Because unless the message from George's mom or this email from Brian is completely fake, Brian, he admits that they let him go, and he didn't seem too happy with Brendan about it. So this is just hilarious if that's true. If Brendan fired him allegedly and then rehired him because of the fight in the kids subreddit and Mark Harley, that is awesome. But I feel like he'll probably just convince George to either do unpaid work and George won't complain, or George will just quit on his own, or Brendan will fire him and he just won't mention it, and he's already doing remote work so nobody will really know. But this is exactly why Brendan needs a handler. Hiring this kid to begin with, I'm not saying he's a bad employee. I'm sure he works really hard and everything. But Brendan does not need any more employees. His podcasting network is failing miserably. Hiring more employees is not going to do anything. It's just going to be another expense. And that's probably what Brendan realized here. But then he also probably realized firing him is a terrible look. These clips of him talking about George have aged so poorly. I mean, it sounds like Brendan convinced him to stay in LA to begin with. Like, he wanted to go back home because he was missing his family. But Brendan's like, dude, I love you. I want you working here. You work so hard. You have so much discipline. And everybody else said he's a really nice kid and they enjoy working with him. So he probably thought, I'm working for my favorite podcaster. This is cool. I'm getting somewhere. And Brendan would just hype him up like crazy. But then during the holiday season, allegedly, maybe Brendan had to let him go. And I guess Brendan rehired him, so everything's good now. But I feel like we'll probably just never hear from George again. And Brendan, he's probably not going to address it. I doubt he will. And he's probably trying to think of some way to either not pay him or just get rid of him. But at least it does sound like Mark Harley and Brian Callen are helping George, so if Brendan does try to pull anything like that, they'll hopefully have his back. And hopefully Brian lets Brendan know how badly he screwed up here. He needs to take some responsibility for once, and he needs to learn to think things through. Like, he always makes the worst decisions, and that's why he needs a handler. I remember, I think 4 or 5 months ago, he made, I believe it was a $5,000, maybe $10,000 bet with Bradley Martin for a UFC event. And he obviously does not have the money, or he should not be spending the money, especially if he allegedly fired George because he couldn't afford to pay him. I mean, that is a terrible look. And of course, Brendan lost the bet and he owed Bradley Martin, I think 5 or 10 grand. And I don't know if he ever paid him. And then also there's another time where Brendan was talking about getting a cane Corso. And I think people were telling him, I'm pretty sure Brian told him, that they're difficult to train and you should be a more experienced dog owner if you're going to get one. But of course, Brendan's like, I got it. I'll figure it out. But then I think after a few months or so, he had to give it back because it wasn't working out. So he just does not learn. Now he's basically doing that with George. But we'll see what happens. Again, George holds all the cards here. If he wants, he could speak out about it. But we'll see. And it'll be interesting to see if Brendan addresses this. I feel like he probably won't, or he'll probably just try to think of some excuse or something. Obviously he's going to try to play it off like nothing happened. But let me know what you guys think about it all down in the comments. And then make sure you go check out my Patreon account. I'm working on a big Andrew Schultz video right now. So if you liked my last video on here about him, I highly recommend it. Or if you're just a fan of the channel, there are over 50 videos on there. So there's a lot of content to go through. And if you're interested, there's a link in the description. Make sure you check it out. And then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.